So this is the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. We are the newest state archives. We didn't have legislation to create the state archives officially until 2003. In 2003, we were granted the permission to be the state archives, but we also did not have the authority to schedule records to come to the state archives. So in 2008, we created the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration that combined a division of public records, which was underneath a different entity than the state archives, and it combined the state archives division from the Secretary of State's office into one. This is the State Record Center. Because Vermont is one of the last states to have officially a state archives, the records in the Record Center go back to 1760. One of the collections that we wanted to talk about today is the Eugenics Survey of Vermont records. The survey was an idea that came out of a professor from the University of Vermont. Professor Perkins was concerned about some of the problems that Vermont was facing, and one of them right after World War II was that apparently a number of Vermonters were rejected by the draft based on what they considered to be defects. And so one of the questions that he has here is, why does Vermont stand so high with so many physical and mental defects? And that came from something that came out of the draft. It turned out to be false over time, but there was perception that Vermonters didn't have quality to them on that draft. And so what he did was organize a project and receive funding to do a survey of Vermonters. And Professor Perkins was very interested in the eugenics movement, which was very popular at the time. That was looking at different ways of, the concept there was to study your genealogy, and that folks that were considered well-born, that's what eugenics means, would have well-born children, and then those that were considered to have defects would only have defects children. So it was a nature versus nurture concept. The method that he had was that he wanted to organize a survey, medical if possible, starting with looking at schools, urban, different rural aspects of the state. So he wanted basically a survey of people, and you can see where he has different proposals, including his proposed sterilization law, which is probably what most people know the Eugenics Survey of Vermont for. It's basically a sterilization bill that looked at sterilizing individuals who were classified as imbeciles, feeble-minded and insane, rapists, confirmed criminals, and other defectives for eugenic purposes. And so he proposes to the state of Vermont. It did not pass initially, but as the survey went on, we did pass a voluntary sterilization bill. They did a very detailed study of every person in the city of Burlington. And in this case, they did it by, you'll see here where it says French Canadian, Jews, Irish, there's Italians. This is a complete survey of different ethnic groups within the city of Burlington. So what they looked at here, and this is just the first person in here, is that they asked their name and birthplace. They asked about where they went to church, what they did, how their children, what kind of schools their children went to. It captures here a lot of social context, and that's why people really like these records. What they did here is that it does give you a little snapshot of people's perceptions at the time, and that's why one of the reasons this collection is so valuable. And here it tells you too what you consider the contributions of different nationalities, and so they had to list what they thought the contributions of French Canadians were. Here it says, not given. Irish, he thinks they're very nice people. Yankees, he thinks they're nice people as well. Didn't seem to have good perception of Jews, felt money makers. Germans said he didn't know any. So it can kind of give you a good snapshot. And these surveys were about 5 pages long for each individual that they did. Here's one of the questions here. To what extent do you want your children to mingle with children of other nationalities but same religion? They do play, but not to marry. Children of other nationalities and of different religions. Protestant, he answered play. Jewish, he said not to play. Here it says, would you be interested in encouraging more ways by which the young people of all the nationalities in the community might get together? And he answered no, and why he wouldn't want them to get together. So it gives you a huge snapshot. We have a number of boxes of these. And some people come in to really understand different perceptions. These records, of course, if you're a family member, they're of interest to know what your relatives or your ancestors thought. But as a collective, it's really interesting to know what folks in Burlington, and then maybe it's a good cross-section of state of Vermont, thought on different topics. The other surveys that were done were very specific to families. And here's an example I'm going to pull out here, and you can see the different pedigree charts that were done. The state of Vermont was a little behind in having a public welfare system, and so it couldn't really help a lot of these children who were orphaned. It also couldn't help a lot of people who were down on their luck. And so the state of Vermont, along with a number of charities and so forth, created a social information network. And the idea there was that they could exchange information about people who had needs and try to assist them, and they also figure out where it's best to apply their resources. This Eugenics Survey of Vermont decided to really look at those people who are listed on the social information exchange. And so here's an example of a pedigree chart that got created for a particular family. And the idea, going back to the eugenics movement, was only well-born people would have well-born children. Defective, quote-unquote, defective people would only have defective children. And so the idea was that they weren't breeding, they weren't really, shouldn't be breeding. So what you'll see here is classification of a particular individual, what they found to be the defect. They would interview, they would get public records for these, they would interview people in the towns, folks that regularly came up in terms of paupery. At the time, the towns had to pay. There were poorhouses. They were not really in very good conditions, particularly for women and children. So they would look for someone who was using town resources. So that would be considered a defect, that you're basically on public assistance. Illiterate was considered a defect. If you were a criminal, immoral, this would be a case of having illegitimate children or being accused of adultery. Dishonest, here you'll see the illegitimate child. If you interacted with the state and you had caused the state to essentially have a charge associated with you, you were on the list. The idea behind the eugenics movement was that they wanted to keep certain people from reproducing. So in some odd way, they felt like they were helping folks, but they really looked at the economy was not very good right now. We're transitioning to a different economy. And so when you looked at economics for it, they were really focusing on people who were costing the state money, what they felt was unnecessary money. And it was perpetuating what they thought was a problem by these people still having children. The state of Vermont has open vital records, so people can come and do research on births and deaths. It's very interesting to research some of these folks that have been labeled as such, feeble-minded or moron, and really see that once they got out of this survey study, they actually led productive lives. So really the role of the state archives is to preserve, in our case, public records. So these are records created within the state of Vermont to ensure that they're accessible to the public, so we really understand where we came from and also better understand where we're going. So a lot of the records that we have here are giving people access to records that allow them to have their rights. So whether they're vital records and land records, persistent rights, documentation of state policies and decisions and the outcomes of those. So either we can repeat them and take them to the next level, or in many cases, if they didn't go so well, not repeat them.